So the new position, this pancritical rationalism, it goes something like this. To be a rationalist, you must start from a position where you entertain any and all positions from the start, including those which you consider most fundamental, such as the possibility of rationalism itself, and all the decisions and philosophical positions that may roll from that. And you hold all of that open to criticism. You protect nothing against criticism, and you justify nothing irrationally. If it were to turn out, for example, that rationality and rationalism was impossible, if you were to create an argument which made you doubt the future options for criticism, you'd have to drop criticism. Now you can see the problem here, especially for critical rationalists. If you start with criticism and you accept that criticism is the way in which we learn about the world and develop knowledge, and yet some of the knowledge that you develop makes you then take the next step towards dumping criticism itself, then what are you left with? The whole enterprise is over. Popper used this and explained this in similar terms. I think David Deutsch does it when he talks about the need to keep open the means of error correction. And I think Popper and Deutsch are talking about the same thing here, that this thing matters and this thing is beyond criticism, because if you were to lose it, then what else could you possibly do? But the question that Bartley's onto here, and what he thinks matters, is why are you protecting it? If it's true, and it will survive, and it ought to survive, then it will. It doesn't matter if you protect it or not. Bartley is open to the idea of pursuing truth wherever it leads, even if it leads to the most uncomfortable of places, which is the end of truth itself. I think Popper isn't. And I think Bartley is looking at Popper and saying, what are you afraid of? Popper is probably looking back at Bartley and saying, it's a nonsense step. What's the value in this? Well, the value is obvious for Bartley. He's aware of the people out there who you'd call irrationalists and just what they're doing and the claims that they're making and how similar those claims are to those that Popper is making. This is the tu quoque argument, the you too, the argument from hypocrisy. If you can do it, then I can do it. Now, at different points in this, Bartley calls his new theory comprehensive critical rationalism. I prefer pancritical rationalism, and I think that's what Bartley does settle on it as well. He is abandoning the idea of comprehensive rationalism, but he's also abandoning the idea, at least in part, of critical rationalism, at least in terms of the mistakes it makes. He has a quote here, and he says, "It does not follow that a man who justifies none of his beliefs irrationally will justify all of them rationally." It's not enough for Popper and people like him to say, but the thing we're holding on to is rationality, is rationalism. A dogmatic commitment to rationality is still a dogmatic commitment, and a rational commitment is still an irrational commitment. And most importantly, what Bartley is onto here is not that he really thinks that it'll ever be proven wrong, but he's kind of looking back at Popper and the critical rationalists and saying, what are you afraid of? Open it up. Let's allow this thing to happen. Let's follow this wherever it may. Bartley's convinced it won't be proven wrong. Popper is thinking it needs to be protected from being proven wrong. At least that's what Bartley thinks. And that's why Bartley calls him a fideist. At all stages in this, Bartley is doing his best to defuse or deconnect rational justificationism from criticism, because he really does look at the history of that and think it is such an error that people have not managed to see how these are still connected. And let's give Bartley some air in this one. Let's see exactly where his theory takes us and where it gets us to an improved place than simply what Popper does. So clearly, I've mentioned a few times how he is trying to win people over. He's taken seriously the arguments of people that other rationalists and critical rationalists don't take seriously. He's trying to win over those Protestants that he spoke about earlier on. Or at least he's trying to show them that if you maintain your beliefs, then you must maintain them irrationally. You don't get to call yourself a rationalist anymore. That's something different. That's what we have. And it's not such a challenging place to get yourself to. I mean, for example, if rationality lies in criticism, at least the heart of it does, and if we then subject everything that we see around us and we hear and we theorize about to continual tests and criticism, including criticism itself in the rational way of life, and we do so and it doesn't lead us into an infinite regress, just like the critical rationalists did or other rational theories did. There's no circularity, there's no justification here, and there's no other difficulties. Then Bartley's theory of rationality is not just a tweak or some play of language or some place that you get to by a roundabout route. But his view of rationality is an unlimited view of rationality, whereas all others are limited. The point is simple, and it's actually quite Popperian when you put it this way. Take your theory, whatever it may be, provided that it can and ought to be open up to criticism, and then do that. And then see what survives, and follow where that leads, even if it leads to a disillusionment of your own rational identity. It probably won't. But what are you fearful of? Now, some of the earlier criticism, and a lot of the criticism we'll get to will be in some of the later chapters of the book, some of the appendices, which are much more interesting than the body of the book itself, because he does take on board all the criticism and all the challenges he sees. But an early criticism is something he sees coming, which is, and this is a quote that he's putting towards himself as a hypothetical critic. He says, "You are probably right in thinking that it is generally possible to separate the notions of justificationism and criticism. But can this separation be extended to the examination of the rational position itself? That is it even possible of what he's saying should happen? Can it be done? Of course, you can try to apply it, but how can you use criticism to then prove that criticism should be done away with? How can you use rationality to prove that rationality should be done away with? Surely the process itself guarantees the outcome cannot be what it sounds like. There seems to be a logical impossibility here, or at least a contradiction at the heart of the logic. Bartley doesn't think there is. And by taking the step that he does get to do the one thing that all the rational traditions have not managed to do, which is call themselves rational. I mean, put it like this. We spoke a little bit about the democratic analogy here, but what do you think if you had a democracy and you created the democracy and you created it in a Popperian light and how important it was, and then throughout that you put a brake on the possibility for democratic suicide, for the system to destroy itself and change? Well, I'm not really sure that buys in. So at that point, once you've done that, it's no longer a democracy at that point. So you have a democracy, you vote in a leader, and or you have a party that's running, perhaps this is a better way to see it, and they say, vote for us, and we'll do away with this whole democracy process. And then you do vote for them, or at least a majority of people do, and they do away with the process. Is this a logical contradiction? It's not. It's using the process to bring an end to the process. And you may think that people are making a tremendous mistake in doing this, and that what they're losing is, like what Deutsch said, the means of error correction. And they are, at least in some ways. But are they not entitled to make that mistake, if it is one? And if you were a Democrat and you put into the heart of the democratic system a protection of democracy, which outlawed such a thing, well, in some ways it's incredibly undemocratic. You're telling them that no matter how many people vote for an end to democracy, we can never have it. The real thing about democracy and the real thing about rationalism is that you don't have to so much trust in it, but you don't have to have an irrational position that you separate from the rest of it. If it works, it works. And if it doesn't destroy itself, then it won't. And if one day it does end up destroying itself, like a democracy might, then that is a hurdle you'll have to deal with when it happens, if you are to call yourself a Democrat after all. Now, after that does change, you've got all sorts of issues and problems and criticisms that you could bring against the new leadership in terms of their undemocratic principles and all the failures that come from that and how we can't reel them back in and keep them in line as a result. But if you're going to be democratic, then you have to be committed to the democratic process, wherever it leads. You don't get to complain tomorrow that the democratic process brought about a leader that you don't think is democratic enough, or at all. And the same applies for rationalism. Why not follow it where it leads? Now, if you're fearful of doing this, which I think people may make the connection when it comes to the democratic issue, if you're fearful of doing this, and so you put a backstop in there, then you're breaking your own principle. And when it comes to rationality, when you're breaking the principle in terms of rationality, then you're dipping into irrationalism. And you open up a whole space to the world where they get to look back at you and say, look, you're just as irrational as the rest of us. And all those grand things you say about yourself, you still can't help but being worried about what the enterprise actually looks like or where it might lead. Bartley is looking at Popper and saying, do you really think that it's possible for me to argue you out of rationalism. And if you do, then you need to make sense of that. But all Bartley is saying is the possibility needs to be kept open. The side who are protecting themselves from this are the ones who really seem to think that it might actually happen. Now, the early way you push back on pancritical rationalism is to go searching for its own irrational commitments. But it doesn't have them. The tu quoque argument doesn't apply. Pancritical rationalism is open to the idea that pancritical rationalism is wrong, and all the fundamental details of it are wrong too. Apply your criticism, let's follow it, and if that comes out, if that's the outcome, then Bartley's willing to go with you. He just doesn't believe it's going to happen. He is being more Popperian than Popper here. He's saying, my theory is bolder than yours. It's more exposed to criticism and refutation. I'm not protecting anything. It's all there. Come along and refute my position. Please, let's see. I want to know if I'm wrong. Popper, the critical rationalists, the comprehensive rationalists, they're not doing this. They're not open to the idea that their theory might be wrong. At least, even if they don't think it's actually going to happen, why not be open to the idea? Bartley thinks a rationalist should look like this. He thinks they should have courage, and they should have the courage of the convictions, and the courage to go on attacking those convictions, and the courage to think and to go on thinking. The word courage is very appropriate here. This is bold. This is exposed, and this is open to risk. This is open to refutation. Just like anyone else, just like any other rationalist, a pancritical rationalist holds countless unexamined presuppositions and assumptions in their theory and in everything that they do. They're there, and you're often blind to them, and often when you see them, you discover that they are false, and you've made a mistake. But the pancritical rationalist's rationality consists in their willingness to submit these to rational consideration. That's what their attitude is, and that's what makes them different. And that's what rationality should look like in Bartley's opinion. Whenever one belief is open to and subjected to criticism, there are of course countless others there that are being taken for granted, including those which are carrying the criticism. Those criticisms are not beyond criticism themselves. They're simply conjectured as good examples, good criticisms, and good challenges. We may only stop criticizing, not when we reach uncriticizable authorities or uncriticizable theories, but only when we discover that we can't think of any criticisms. We hit a position and we can't think of a reasonable criticism to apply. That's the only reason to stop, and it's a temporary stop. There is no theoretical limit to the process. Criticizability and rationality, if we're going to fuse them, and I think we should, and Bartley thinks we should, and Popper thinks we should, if we're going to fuse the two, then why put a theoretical limit on what they can do? What Bartley thinks Popper's done here, and the critical rationalists have done here, is he thinks they're still tied up in a classical problem, a tradition of rationality, what the comprehensives had. The problem is by trying to criticize things or trying to apply rationality in terms of justification. And this always leads to an infinite regress or to dogmatism. But there is nothing within logic itself, as Bartley goes on to explain here, that prevents us from holding everything open to criticism and non-justificational criticism. You simply don't have to make that extra step that Popper is making. Now, this is not a change. I'm sure most people listening will recognize that Bartley is very close to Popper here in what his theory looks like. So this is not open to the idea of saying, well, statements and valid arguments, none of these do exist, and just by holding them open to criticism, I believe that none of them are true. Of course not. Bartley is not out that far on the limb here. The only step that Bartley's making here, it may look like a small one, but it's actually quite large when you think about the history of rationality. It's not simply a redefinition of the word. And as he writes, it's not in, or at least that he's aware of, and I can't see how it would be, a design that's been put forward to fit his own desires and his prejudices while avoiding philosophical difficulty. It's not in his own mind. And it's too easy, and I think too many people have done this over the years, to dismiss it as a kind of cheap solution. I think that's what Agassiz did. I think that's what Jarvie didn't do. But a lot of other rationalist theories have looked this way. When the problem like the dilemma of ultimate commitment arises, and we propose theories to solve it, or have proposed theories to solve it in the past, often people do use language, terms that within language and tradition have different connotations. And some of those changed connotations may often, and Bartley thinks this happens more often than we notice, prevent the theory itself from adequately being solved. Though sometimes it may look like we have, in fact, solved an issue by simply twisting a word or using a new definition. But Bartley says that what's taken place here is not simply a redefinition of the word, but the theory itself has been fundamentally changed by the elimination of an assumption, which was smuggled into the theory inside one of those terms. Bartley doesn't want to play language games here. He doesn't want to twist the theory. His vision of rationality is one that he thinks can satisfactorily solve the dilemma of ultimate commitment, the original problem, to which all these, and he calls them self-conscious theories of rationality, evolved within the rational tradition itself. So what counts as criticism here? Now, Popper's answer, at least in the logic of scientific discovery, is it's a check on empirical experience. But there is considerable disagreement out there in just what kind of criticism should apply against what kinds of theories. Now, it also ought to be said that we cannot definitively refute theories either. It's always tentative, just like theories themselves are. Any theory that we refute will only be refuted in relationship to the critical arguments that we put forward and whether it is compatible or incompatible with those theories. What pancritical rationalism does is show a willingness to hold open to criticism and revision everything in principle, even those notions that we believe are most secure and part of the spirit or the heart of pancritical rationalism itself. We don't need to get sucked back into justificationism. We can diffuse the two. And importantly, Bartley thinks that pancritical rationalism is the only time that this diffusion has actually happened. That is the first time in the history of rationality and rationalism that justification and rationalism have properly been decoupled. So, back to that, what counts as criticism? Well, Bartley has 4 different ways of what criticism can be and how we can eliminate error in the world. First is a check of logic. The second is a check of sensory experience. The third is a check of a scientific theory and whether it is in conflict with your hypothesis or your existing theory. And the fourth is a check of the problem itself. What is the theory, what is the problem intended to do and solve? And does it do so successfully? And with that, on a similar note, Bartley is following the line here, that he thinks ideas and theories ought to be evaluated in terms of their capacity to solve the problems that they were designed to solve, the problem situation. Does it solve the problem, or simply does it shift it elsewhere? Does it solve it better than competing theories and competing ideas? Does it create worse problems or better problems? Does it contradict other theories? And importantly, is it fruitful in producing new valuable problems that we can see and use and address and then solve? And Bartley sees the history of rationality a little like this. That comprehensive rationalism, the one before critical rationalism, where we start with a foundation and build rationality from that. That kind of rationality actually failed to solve its own problem. It led to a crisis of integrity. It didn't produce rationality, it didn't produce truth. And then comes along critical rationalism. But for Bartley, the critical rationalist tradition did attain integrity of a kind. It did fix that crisis, but at the expense of ignoring the problem itself and accidentally stepping into it in a way, or stepping into it while thinking that they weren't stepping into the same problem that the previous people did have. It is pancritical rationalism that solves the original problem and does so with integrity. It's pancritical rationalism that solves the challenge of how you can get to truth or how rationality is even possible without becoming irrational in the process. Now, for many people, they may say this is just a problem of logic, and one of these appendices we'll get to later on is focused just on that. And they say, well, we can just ignore that in a way. What's the problem? But for Bartley, if you attempt to reject logic, then a whole range of other problems roll from this. From a contradiction, things actually follow. And if you allow contradiction to be smuggled into a set of views, no matter what they are, it doesn't do so without harming a whole range of things that you can't see happening until often it's too late. Look at it like this, and this is an example that Bartley uses about just how fraught allowing contradictions into our thinking can be. So this is the contradiction he has in mind. He says that, imagine for instance that you allow the view that John F. Kennedy is identical with Nikita Khrushchev. And then you also allow the view that John F. Kennedy is not identical with Nikita Khrushchev. Obvious contradiction, of course. Now you may look at that and say, well, what's the harm, right? It's just a contradiction, it's a pretty obvious one. What's the harm? Well, Bartley says that if you allow this, then any other statement, as well as its contradiction, also follows as true. It inclines the listener to believe that the person who is putting forward this kind of logic is someone who really doesn't know what they're talking about. Now, the defense that people tend to use against this is that to say that, sure, everything follows from a contradiction. The space is completely opened up and now anything is allowed, but only within the inadequate logic that we're already setting out. And this will not happen once we get to the higher logic or God's logic or a prophet's logic. And of course, different categories of logic do exist, of course. There are alternative logics out there. Aristotelian logic, for example, of categorical propositions. Now this has been abandoned, or at least retained only for very limited use. It's just clumsy and restrictive. And when we think about logical inference, there are various alternative systems here. They differ amongst themselves quite a bit, yet they all tend to have one reasonably solid thing in common. That is a set of rules that we start from true premises, argue in accordance with them, and then we arrive eventually at true conclusions. The real problem with these things, or with when you talk about logic in this way, is simply a question of whether we can revise the logic itself, whether we can deny that the true premises need to always lead, as they have, to valid inferences or true conclusions. Is it open to contradiction and challenge? Can we get involved in this? Or do we have to accept that that's the way it is, and do we have to accept the contradictions where we find them? Do we have to accept that Kennedy and Khrushchev are in fact the same person, and in fact are different people, simply because the contradiction does exist? Now, to run any kind of test, you do need logic, but non-revisable logic? I don't think so, and neither does Bartley. The idea of revising in light of tests, no matter how they turn out, the idea of critical argument, might and does presuppose a number of things. In terms of the logic, it presupposes deducibility. It presupposes the idea that transmission of falsity does happen from conclusion back to premises, and also that the transmission of truth goes in the other direction, from premises down to conclusions. But all these presuppositions can and ought to be open to criticism. That's what Bartley's nailing at here. If the totality of what we believe, all of it, is X, or at least implies X, which is, perhaps you might think of it in terms of criticism or keeping the means of error correction open. If what we really believe to be true, and the totality of those beliefs implies this thing, which we will call X in this situation, and if we run tests and we get the result which is not X, then there is likely to be a mistake in our set of beliefs, something that needs to be corrected. Now, just where that correction happens, it could be in the test itself, it could be in the beliefs themselves, but don't you want to see that outcome? Don't you want to see not X? Don't you want the test to be run? We can and ought to be strong enough in our convictions and our courage to say two things and not just one. That everything, including the practice of arguing and revising, is open to criticism and rejection. And two, as long as we continue to do that, to revise and criticize, as long as we have not rejected the whole practice, sure, there's a certain type of logic that we need grounded here, but it itself is revisable. It is entailed within the idea of revision. It doesn't have to be held apart. And what really matters within an argument, Bartley goes on to say, is just that particular revisability criteria, I think he calls it. It's a new kind of demarcation, which is to look at the beliefs that are revisable within an argument situation. Again, not a problem situation, but an argument situation. So which ideas and beliefs are revisable within it, and those that are not. And now anything that is not within that argument situation, well, it's non-revisable. It sits outside the situation itself. And we need to apply a new argument situation towards it. Not just to leave it sitting there and accept that it is beyond what we can touch, because it's clearly and logically not. What you can't throw out is logic itself. You can't abandon it. You can't accept contradictions within logic, because if you do, you are in fact defying your own intentions. thwarting your own intentions, Bartley puts it. Now, Bartley leaves this section off with a little thought, and just how we should proceed in a way. He looks at philosophers and how they've come about, and he said many have argued that we can decide freely and irrationally between two unjustifiable theories, and we can do so however we please. Both theories are unjustifiable, and therefore the question of rationality doesn't come into it. Bartley isn't buying this. He says we can decide freely and irrationally, but only if what we're doing is a matter of taste, and the two theories that we are choosing between have no existing criticisms of either. Neither one is able to be defeated, and you have no reason to prefer one than the other, or to think one is more likely to be in error. This reduces whim, actually. It may not sound like it, but it does. It strips out justification, because we're not interested in justification. And of course, there's more to this. There's something to be saved. There are very few, at least important philosophical traditions, against which we cannot find any kind of decisive criticism, or none exist at all. And if you cannot think of one, if none does exist, well, the logic tells you that one can exist. It simply has to be found. So, if you're a critical rationalist and you can't imagine a possibility of discovering a way in which rationality or criticism might be proven wrong or unachievable, then that's not enough. It's not enough to abandon the enterprise and say, well, I can't think of this. Unless what you're doing is simply making, as Bartley said, a decision which is a matter of taste. What he doesn't want you to do is to retreat into commitment, into what must be a justificationist framework. Because he's saying it's just no longer necessary. We don't have to. And if we don't, then we deny people the space to do so too. Anyone throwing around the tu quoque argument loses the ability to do so. Rationality is off the chain. It's unlimited. It's unbounded. And the logic of rationality itself demands that we do this, as tempting as it may be to accept contradictions inside the theory. Bartley is seeing himself here as fulfilling an idea that Popper couldn't quite bring himself to. He sees himself as being more Popperian than Popper himself, and of allowing critical rationalism to become what it ought to have always been, a theory without contradictions, without justificationism, and without a rational commitment. And that is right now the end of chapter 5. If you think that you're not following that so well, there'll be a chunk at the end of the book where he brings in a lot of criticism. And just like what happens with a lot of times when you hear really good criticism, you begin to understand the theory better itself. And as if you may have been following Bartley in this, and you may have actually been agreeing with him in a lot of this, and you can't see some of the challenges that are coming his way, then he will bring those forward as well and do his best to push back upon them. So don't worry too much if you think there are some holes in your understanding, or if you think the opposite, that Bartley is just too convincing in all this, and surely Popper would have seen the error of his ways, and why haven't the critical rationalists followed him? Well, these are all open questions that Bartley is going to get into when he opens up the criticism later on. But for now, that's the end of chapter 5.